Universities have historically held and acquired collections of First Nations cultures in various iterations, such as art, archives and cultural material. Increasingly, these collections have been employed for reconnection and reconciliation, uncovering old perspectives and creating new narratives that utilise interdisciplinary approaches with First Nations perspectives to amplify the voices of the makers. The Voicing the Living Archive, working with First Nations collections in higher education symposium, was held at the University of Canberra on July the 18th and 19th, 2024. It highlighted some recent projects that focus and examine First Nations collections across different areas of universities, from research to teaching. The event was organised by Dr. Wendy Somerville, Hakim Rahim Abdul and Katie Hain of the University of Canberra, and supported by the International Council of Museums Committee for University Museums and Collections and the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at the University of Canberra.
So I'll just sort of do a little introduction on the next talk. It's going to be about circulating and connecting stories, Indigenous pedagogies as alternative economies. So first, let me introduce Denise. Denise is a curator, writer, and researcher of British and Uyghur descent who lives and works on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. She's currently senior lecturer in interdisciplinary arts at the University of Canberra, where her research focuses on contemporary cultural economies. She's had extensive experience in academia and also in industry. Welcome, Denise.
I'd like to begin by just acknowledging that we're meeting on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today, a site where vital knowledge and culture has been transmitted since time immemorial. And as we'll be discussing circulating culture and knowledge, I want to pay respect to the elders of these nations, past, present, and emerging, who continue this incredibly vital work. So I'm so delighted to be here today with Wendy to learn from an amazing group of scholars and practitioners at the event. And I'm particularly honoured to be in your company today as a woman of settler colonial lineage on my father's side and Uyghur heritage on my mother's side. You may have heard the term Uyghur in the news headlines about forced labour and re-education camps and cultural genocide, and not realise that we are a proud Turkic ethnic group that's Indigenous, what we use as Yörük, to East Turkestan in Central Asia, which is called Xinjiang, New Territory in China. So I'm really incredibly grateful to everyone in this room doing hard and important anti-colonial work. And I'm really conscious of the power of this work to resonate and create waves of translocal solidarity. Excuse me. But we're here today to talk about how the brilliant work of Wendy and her colleagues in the Thad Indigenous Minor, which myself, Bethany Turner and Tracy Ireland are delighted to share as part of a book project called Alternative Economies of Heritage. As an edited collection, the book has a specific aim to platform perspectives, projects and voices that have been typically marginalised in or excluded from authorised heritage practices. With contributions spanning all 5 continents, it includes Indigenous perspectives from Aboriginal, Maori, Mapuche and Squamish practitioners. And by bringing these voices and case studies together, Alternative Economies of Heritage aims to amplify translocal conversations about who participates in everyday heritage economies, how resources and practices of care are corralled and enacted, and how authorised heritage practices can be resisted and transformed through socio-culturally specific attention to cultural value. So, why alternative economies? Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson once said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And this off-cited, and some might say tired, statement speaks to the paralysis of colonial imaginaries to envisage systems of value beyond the triumphalist discourse of free market capitalism. But what if alternative economic models are not only imaginable and possible, but already exist? And how might our engagement with a global array of extant alternative economies of heritage, such as those modelled by First Nations communities and cultures across the globe, serve to enliven an otherwise tired economic imaginary in the capitalist scene? For the most part, the professional heritage sector has relied on international charters to divorce heritage value or significance from financial matters, positioning its frameworks as obstacles to profiteering activities such as property development, mining, or the commercial use of intellectual property. However, we argue that this tendency to divorce heritage practice from economic thinking conceals the inequities of the heritage sector's own implicit economies. In reality, heritage workers practice economy daily, interacting complex, formal and informal systems of cultural evaluation and exchange in the transmission of community stories, images and artefacts between and across generations. And this is something that Professor Sandy O'Sullivan aptly highlighted earlier as operating in the university museum context. I think you gave an example of facilitating, a swapsy between a contemporary commissioned artwork against a collection item. And indeed, Dr. Rose Barracliffe's discussion just now about how IP rights are used to make claims to ownership. So we contend that beyond serving as arbiters of cultural currency within globally scaled colonial heritage systems that determine who and what counts as valuable, contemporary interdisciplinary heritage practice could perhaps be in a unique position to challenge the fields of historical enmeshment with colonial imperatives to accumulate value. And so to do so, our book turns to the premise outlined in feminist economic scholarship by people like Gibson Graham and Stephen Healy, as well as the insights of Senegalese philosopher Felwine Sarr that emphasise the simultaneous coexistence of many diverse economies. We do have a tendency to conflate the word economy with the formal extractive capitalist economy, but trade and exchange long predate that specific mode of production, as we know through the rich history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander economies that have been practiced across this continent long before European invasion. And admittedly, my interest may partially be informed by, my own cultural inheritance coming from an Islamic Silk Road culture, where trade and exchange is not in opposition to caring for community. For me, the way economy implies the goods in circulation invites us to consider how university collections can work in the way that, again, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan previously discussed, as facilitating a kind of flow of stories and objects into alternative community spaces, beyond the sort of the accumulation and the keeping of something as a static asset. And it's through that circulation that you can transform public imaginaries. So with that in mind, our edited collection seeks to platform alternative economies of cultural value, inheritance and exchange, which often sustain the formal heritage sector while being rendered largely invisible. And in doing so, our book attends to the different ways value is expressed. We consider how embracing alternative economies of heritage require not only a diversification of what content is valued, but also the styles and forms of expression through which that value is articulated. Again, linking back to, these distinctions between ethnographic versus contemporary art, and the need to think about how the language and the affects around those words need to be dissembled if we're really to be more inclusive of what is, or to reevaluate these kinds of economies. As suggested by Gibson Graham, a post-capitalist politics not only demands experimentation that supports bottom-up networks of labour and exchange, but also the recognition of how the circulation of affects can support new perceptions of what is possible, this idea of new imaginaries. Our volume thus presents experimental, lyric and poetic approaches alongside more conventional analyses of heritage practices through a range of disciplinary lenses, including those from contemporary arts practitioners, people working in contemporary cultural practice, cultural geography, environmental humanities, and beyond. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, a recurrent theme across the diverse contributions to the book is the vital role of sharing stories and story work as a method for cross-cultural and cross-generational knowledge transmission. And this drew our attention to a side of heritage storytelling and knowledge transmission, which, while fundamental to the generation and exchange of value, is often rendered invisible in heritage research, which is the classroom. Scholars such as Paulo Freire have long emphasised the emancipatory power of critical pedagogies to address political oppression and social marginalisation in communities. The classrooms of higher education, however, have long been associated with the ossified knowledge hierarchies and power dynamics, which are a reflection of those colonial lineages. So in this context, the work of Wendy Somerville and her wonderful colleagues who teach into the Indigenous minor model an alternative system of cultural value and exchange between students and teachers, which serves to destabilise the colonial legacies inherited by contemporary higher education. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic to Wendy, who will share a little bit about this work.
Thanks, Denise. It's always interesting to hear how my work is viewed by others. I just see it as, here we go, this is, and the next step, and the next step. So, as our book chapter does, I'll start by introducing the First Nations Collaborative Research Web. And I'll start with a quote. And the quote is from Gambian activist Gary Foley. He recently said in the Truth and that forum in Melbourne treaty, it is possible to change your world, but you can't do it by yourself. So that resonates with me and with the other members of our web. Our new research theme, I should be more careful about what I'm saying here, developed through the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. So I'm going to explain this through the metaphor of a spider's web. Our research web has at its centre 5 Indigenous women. We are Del Fraser, who you heard this morning, Ngunnawal woman, Ashley Van Den Heuvel, Walbunja woman, and Lisa Fuller, Waka Waka Willy Willy woman, and the wonderful Andrea Stapgaunt, who isn't here, and she's a Maori from Ngati Paru. And the spider's web that I started off with is a connection of lines that appear delicate but are strong and flexible. The framing line for the web is our knowledges and experience. The web is anchored to hold and protect our diverse viewpoints. Our web is not meant to entrap, but to expand, to allow growth, or in the words of the inimitable Katie Hain, global domination. There's a current research project most of us are involved in, that it also includes Bethany Turner up there, but it also includes female Indigenous and non-Indigenous collaborators from UC, the University of Wollongong, and Edith Cowan University. We're really proud of the work we've done in a previous research project. For that previous research project, we showcased it called Kind Regards, Negotiating Connection to Country and Place through Collective Storying at the ICOMOS International Conference. You know, everyone wants to go to an international conference. It was in Sydney. So we did that last year. And we led people through exercises using a storying methodology. So that's a little bit of where we're coming from. And one day we're actually going to have a room or somewhere where we, it just blew me away. What Sandy's got up at Macquarie. We do have one commissioned piece of artwork. We got it last year for another symposium, and CCR paid for it, but we haven't got anywhere to put it, so it's at my place. Oh, it might be like that.
Yeah.
So now on to the catalyst for our inclusion in the heritage book that you're
Stephanie.
editing.
With
So the members of the web all teach in the Indigenous minor in the Culture and Heritage degree. The teaching we do acts as an alternative heritage economy so that it shapes future heritage practitioners and students from other disciplines as well. The alternative heritage economy here, as we think of it, is in the value of the exchange of knowledge and experience that Indigenous academics bring to teaching and research. Those two things, knowledge and experience, are always present in the ways that we care for and provide support for each other. Collaboration is central to our teaching and researching philosophy. We work collectively in both areas with our research flowing into and animating our teaching practice. So this is a story of the story we tell in the textbook, not the textbook, book is about how we won a small grant to produce an online textbook or study guide through the Council of Australian University Librarians. The title of the textbook, Connecting Stories, Understanding Indigenous Knowledge and Values, was chosen to signal that story is the heart of most First Nations Australian cultures. It is our own system of education, reflecting that everything is connected and interwoven with various permission protocols. So that study guide centres stories and knowledge on country. Country is at the heart of our teaching. For anyone who hasn't heard, country is the relationship between all entities found in a particular place. As an aside, and something I might tell my students, on my mother's side, I am of Jerinja country. I'm related to all things that fly, slither, and so on. Everything that belongs to that country is related to me. I'm related to it. Country is where my knowledge comes from. When I die, my soul will travel to Kulanguddy, where it will jump off the mountain to travel across the sea and eventually up into the sky to become an ancestor. That is part of my country. So back to the book, which also aligns with the teaching of the Indigenous Studies minor. Units in the minor are named Connections to Country, Indigenous Ways of Knowing, Indigenous Cultures and Digital Contexts, and Culture, Voicing the Living Archive. It was previously called Decolonising the Museum. The first two are foundational units, while Indigenous Cultures and Digital Context presents First Nations peoples as contemporary people entwined with modernity and technology. The final unit, Culture Voicing the Living Archive, asks students to examine institutional structures in the GLAM sector, as well as private and government institutions, to critique representations in those systems. So the textbook, and I'm finishing off, the textbook is structured thematically and introduces foundational concepts. As are the classes we teach, the textbook is shaped by the voices of Indigenous scholars throughout. And that's my little piece. Thank you.
Well, all I wanted to kind of emphasize is that this is a very meta idea. So the textbook is written about in the chapter of a book that you're writing about as well.
Yeah, so there are layers of book. There are two books.
And then the what's informing the textbook is our work with the students. And I can see some lovely students here. So I just wanted to give a shout out and say thank you for coming. Because that's why we are here in this university, because of you. And what, you know, I think it's quite important to acknowledge that we do our work over the years is informed by the students that we work with. And so that's kind of coming through as well. But it's something that I don't think we quite know how to acknowledge. So and how do we start kind of sharing the work that students do and acknowledging students in that process as well? So that's actually something I wanted to like get around to eventually asking is how do we kind of emphasize the student engagement with the textbook just by the fact that they're there and we're teaching and we're kind of testing our ideas out on them.
Yeah. This is an Ashley question. And the Wendy answer is, I'd love to know too. It's that question about decolonizing. How do you know? I want to know. Can it be done? I tell my students no. I ask them to go and look at an object in that we have beautiful, beautiful objects. Incredibly gorgeous objects, like that featherwork you were speaking about earlier, and I ask them to go and look at. I give them clues as to what they might be looking at in a museum exhibition. So off they go, and they come back, and their eyes have been opened. So it's just the fact that really, really, we want you to be critical, and we want you to go and have a look and come back and tell us. Well, they have to write a report, but you know, they do also tell us in class. And I think that's really an engagement when we ask them to give their impressions of that sort of thing. You know, I know when Del was my student many years ago, and she went off down to the NMA, I think it was, and you walked through, the last thing you saw were chains, and it was just very strange. Yes, yeah,
Oh, the question from the back.
yes.
Thank you. This has been a really, really lovely, interesting, challenging morning. You just prompted me to think about currently there's a methodology called Significance 2.0.
Yeah.
Which, you know, many people use to assess significance. And now the Commonwealth Department has put out a 2.5 month period for people to make comments for an update. And I'm, well, one of my many hats is I'm Vice Chair of ICOM Australia, and we're looking at this and thinking, this is ridiculous. There has been so much work done in the last 15 years. You cannot have an ad hoc 2-month period for comment. And we're actually pushing, and I would actually very strongly encourage everyone to push back and say, we need a proper consultative process of at least 12 to 18 months for good consultation, discussion, to bring in the academic views, to bring in experiential views, to bring it up to date with actually what we are experiencing nowadays. So I really strongly advise the university and everyone here to push back and say, come on, because this is what we're going to be doing as ICOM Australia, saying this is why, this is all the sorts of things that should be thought about it and should be drawn upon. There are other frameworks that have been pulled together in the last 15 years as well. It's really important. So there.
Thanks, Alex. And I will recommend that someone who has a memory remembers that.
Heritage conservation. So we look at, sorry, heritage values and systems. And one of the activities I was going to get students to do this semester is have a look at that revision process and use Significance 2.0. And I love that name, by the way. And talk about like, well, what would we suggest and what are our experiences of following these practices to assess our own artifacts and personal heritage. So maybe I'll now go further and make them submit those suggestions.
That's valuing their contribution.
Putting on my old public service hat, there's how many Aboriginal nations? You should actually start talking about them as stakeholders, like they are advisors, cultural advisors, but to actually speak within a government or getting a contract or getting out is kind of changing the language, but reinforcing this isn't 5 agencies. Even in New South Wales, how many nations do we have? Like Wiradjuri is the biggest nation, but there are like 5 groups. Sissy, yeah, more than that. So just being able to consult, you're right, push back and say, no, we can't do this within our timeframes. So just old public service hat.
Yeah, we don't think about it often, but.
Sandy?
Thanks. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. And I think one of the things that we're doing at the moment is we've got a master's that we're putting together. And, you know, when we first started thinking about it, we were thinking about doing a good old master's in glam, except it's nonsense. Sorry, it's nonsense. Not just because glam's like a dang old term that nobody uses anymore, but because it's something much broader than that. You know, we're centering it out obviously from Indigenous studies, but it got us thinking about these elements, and it definitely got us thinking about some of these policy processes that seem to be just nailed down to existing systems and require responses from existing systems. We're actually calling it a Master's in Cultural Public Practice. And I think it'll be really interesting. The more the merrier, right?
Yeah.
But what's really interesting about it is that the interest is engaged from beyond the museum, but also within it, from beyond universities, but from within it, from beyond, you know, governments sectors, and also within it. And there is this desire for a discussion that crosses over these boundaries. And so I think texts like this too support that. You know, it's beyond the idea of just, you know, how this gets managed into a curriculum and becomes about the broader discussions that we have to have. And I mean, if archives are useful at in universities at all in that way, you know, then it can only be to stimulate conversation, get those relationships going, and to consider returns and consider, the ongoing relationships. But it was really, I'm so excited about the book as well. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, just building off the point that Ashley made earlier as well about how we really think about valuing the students' contributions. I've thought a lot about that too, right? And how a lot of the institutions that we're a part of disenfranchised and are really built around the premise that their contribution isn't as valuable as ours, right? And it's interesting because there's so much research, you know, like Paulo Freire's work and people who are, you know, like Jacques Rancière, lots of people thinking about what does it mean to practice equality in reality, and how much a lot of that happens outside of the university wall. In, you know, that happens in community. That's right. It happens in community settings, and so how to start thinking about like how we operate in that liminal space, and like how can we use the privileges or powers that we might have by having access to certain things here, but then bringing them into community settings and other kinds of organizational settings. And is that the way in which we can do things like start to be able to reconfigure relationships of learning? Because I do think, like, you know, I'm always one to be like colonial capitalism, but I do think that there are kind of like foundational issues sometimes in ossified structures within the academy that are really difficult to fight against. So I think those little edges might be helpful. Yeah.
So what I was just thinking about, as everyone's been thinking, and some of the things I've been thinking about as we've been talking, is so as Indigenous scholars, we really do have to work in like critiquing the systems and working, so we think quite a lot about that. And at UC, our heritage program it's got 4 Indigenous studies units as a part of it. But the other thing that I think about quite often is how so we call it culture and heritage. By we I mean that's the name. And I think it's something Wendy mentioned that people might not realize as well is so the names of some of the Indigenous units, for example, decolonizing the museum. There was a really long drawn out process that needed to be taken for that name to be changed to Voicing the Living Archive. And so that work does happen. But what I've been thinking about is the conservation side of our degree as well, because that's a big part of what draws students to the Culture and Heritage program. Because and even in the structure of the description of our degree, those are postgraduate units. And so they're not even named in the structure of the study plans until someone comes in and says, oh, I actually want to actually know how to care for and conserve and look after these objects that we so love and kind of speak about. So I think it's just, there's so many different layers in this kind of these university collections that people might just not be aware of. And I think that's why what we're doing is something that we see as being important, because it's kind of, we are naturally, like, because of our position within this academy, critiquing those systems and thinking about it all the time. And so it really informs our work. And it is a lot of like what happens with the students and understanding what they want out of their education as well. That's part of what we do.
Yes.
So
It's no use naming names, but they can say that obviously there have been places that have failed, and it has been because they haven't done that, because they can't see a way forward to continue on and still do this engagement. And there's a reason for that, it's out of step.
I remember one time we had the general faculty exhibition, and some various students, young high school students came along, and there were a group of students, and there were some Aboriginal students in them. And we had some of the Aboriginal artifacts on display. And one of the students, like the young students, asked me, it's like, oh, can we conserve this as well? And I said, yes, of course, just come and study this. But they thought that perhaps because they're an Aboriginal student, like an Aboriginal high school student, that they wouldn't be able to, they didn't even realize they could come and care for and learn how to care for the artifacts that are relevant to their own culture and communities and experiences as well. So
That's been about the us and them stuff, the idea that
So it's like
that audiences are white audiences, objects belong to, it's just part of that same narrative that just perpetuates, and it happens within the academy too. But that process of being able to change, for instance, course structures and so on, it's every university is like that, and they're behemoths, and it's the same as museums in a lot of ways. It's this idea of the system being the most important thing and retaining the process rather than being fit for purpose. And I think we have to keep talking about fit for purpose when it comes to serving students and serving their needs, and also serving the broader community, particularly the community of practice. The community of practice is not a bunch of bad actors. It's a lot of people who want good, and they want to understand better. And yes, there's some bad actors in there, but for the most part, people want to do better. And and it's hard when there's an interaction through training between universities and, for instance, museums, as an example. And that mismatch is a massive problem. And in spite of the talking with one another, or even the belonging to both places. So again, I go back to the more that we have texts that provide sites of interpretation, the better it is.